Recording should be in process. So my name is Tracy Philippi. I'm the Library Programming and Outreach Specialist for the Village of Cottage Grove. We're really excited to have author Jack Mitchell here from the Wisconsin Historical Society. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, we do have a couple upcoming virtual programs we'd like to share. Let's see here, sorry. In August, on August 8th at 7 p.m. here at Village Hall, we'll be hosting How Did Wisconsin Become the Cheese State with Badger Talks. On November 7th at 7 p.m., we'll be hosting another Historical Society talk entitled A Toast to Wisconsin Historic Bars and Breweries, and that will be at Grace Coffee. And then at noon on November 13th, we'll be welcoming a librarian from the Dane County Library Service to teach us all about Libby. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speaker tonight. Jack Mitchell, author of Wisconsin on the Air, 100 Years of Public Broadcasting in the State That Invented It, was the head of Wisconsin Public Radio for 21 years. He is currently a professor emeritus at the University of Wisconsin School of Journalism and Mass Communications and serves on the boards of the Wisconsin Center for Journalism Ethics and the Wisconsin Center for Investigative Journalism. So with that, we're going to switch over the recordings here.
Oh, okay. I guess I'm unmuted. Okay, good. Well, I do have the book that we were going to be talking about of Wisconsin on the Air, but I'm going to depart from that a little bit because first of all, the book's out of print. It was published 7 or 8 years ago, and so it's done. But secondly, it's only part of my experiences, and I thought I'd expand a little bit and talk about. So it's not going to be precisely Wisconsin on the Air. So I'm going to begin in 1917. 1917 in Madison, Wisconsin, January of 1917. Think of it as a cold, yucky, awful January night. It's dark. And Professor Earl Terry invites a bunch of people to his house in Madison. Professor Terry is a professor of physics, and his office is in Science Hall, which is down on the main campus, across from the Wisconsin Union. And Professor Terry has been working in trying to develop radio. Radio was invented around the turn of the century with Marconi. Remember Marconi you've heard about him. He sent telegraph messages across the Atlantic. And so we had telegraphs using radio waves, and that was not a new thing. But like a lot of other people in physics, this was the new thing. It was sort of like AI today. Well, this was, radio broadcasting or radio in 1917. And so he had classes, and every semester they would build a radio set, see if they get to get to work. It was at the end of the semester, they tear it down, and another class comes in and they keep building up. Finally, he decided in 1917 that let's stop tearing them down and let's try to use this darn thing. And he had a guide of what it ought to be with the Wisconsin idea, the notion that the university should serve everybody in the state, not just the students on campus, but we ought to reach out to everyone. And it's much bigger than radio, but radio fit into that. And so he invited a group of deans and all kinds of important people to come to his house to demonstrate that this thing would work. So he had a student at Science Hall. They strung a wire up to the chimney of the heating plant over to the Science Hall roof. And he did and they put on, and he had a radio in his living room. And they played a tune called Narcissus recording record. And I don't have a copy of it. I wanted to play Narcissus because it's a cute little tune. You'll recognize it. But they played it and it went up and over and got picked up in the room. And he expected people to gasp and be thrilled, and they weren't. So what? What's the big deal? Well, they didn't understand what was really going on here, that you could actually broadcast voice and music and have content. And that's what the point was, that the Wisconsin idea said that you'd spread the university to the whole state. And they were looking at having that you could extend the university to all around the state. Okay, let's jump ahead now to 50 years later. 50 years later? 50 years later. 50 years later. What would that be? 1967. Here we are, 50 years later. And we have had something that's come along, and there come a couple of sub slides, I think. Oh, I can do that? Oh, well, I'm not sure what's there. I just hit things and see what happens. Okay, well, it's 67. Now it's 50 years later. This 9XM WHA had been on the air for 50 years. And it had really developed. It became the leading educational radio station in the country. And they had developed the Wisconsin State Radio Network, which was a series of FM stations all over the state that carried WHA programming to the entire state. Now, remember, this was to extend the university. The problem was that most of the faculty at the university couldn't care less about this and wouldn't lift a finger to produce programs for the new radio network, except the extension people for the farm extension and the homemaking exception. So the two main programs they had on the air was a farm show and the homemaker show, produced by the home ec department and the ag department. And so those were the two main shows. Beyond that, they had to go to the classroom lectures, and they would go out to a lecture and they just tape it. They didn't bother the professor. He didn't have to do anything more than he normally does. They'd haul it back to the studio, play the tapes, and you'd have 39 weeks on Russian history, 39 hours of Russian history. It wasn't real popular. But some people liked it, and certainly the professors liked it because they were on the radio and they didn't have to do anything except just do what they normally do. This came about, though, because the state legislature got behind it and created the state radio network primarily for schools. That the WHA was producing programs for use in the schools. Now remember, Wisconsin had lots of small underfinanced schools with 3 or 4 teachers, maybe in the whole building. They did not have a science teacher. They did not have a music teacher. They did not have an art teacher. And so they did these programs for these small schools that did the specialized topics and the science and music. Pop Gordon, who you folks are too young to remember, but he did this program every couple of times a week where he'd teach songs and the kids in the classrooms would sing along. And then come May or so, they would bus all these kids from all over the state into the Stock Pavilion here in Madison, and Pop Gordon would lead them all in singing the songs that they'd been learning all year. It was a very older folks than this crowd remember that fondly. It was a highlight of their year. They'd go down to drive down to Madison and sing these songs. The more interesting one, though, was a program called Let's Draw, in which they would have the professor would say, okay, kids, think about being sad. Yeah. Draw what you feel. And they would do whatever they would do. And then they would send their pictures into Madison. They would have a group of people who graded them, and everybody got good grades. And then they send them back saying, good work, wonderful, great, you drew such a sad picture. And the idea was they tried to, that it worked because it was radio. They tried to move it to television when television came along, and it didn't work because the teacher would draw something and the kids would copy it. But on radio, they used their imagination and they came out. So that was a big success. So School of the Air was a big thing. College lectures, the farm show, the homemaker show, that was pretty much what it was all about. And they've been going for 50 years, been doing that. And okay, so 1967, and now we're going to change places. Still 1967, but we're going over to Ann Arbor, Michigan, to a radio station called WUOM in Ann Arbor. Try saying that on the air, which I had to do because that's where I was working. I was a grad student at Michigan in 1967. And that station was quite different. It was mostly classical music. And it was FM. A couple of things about FM. First of all, hardly anybody had FM radios because they were expensive and why bother? But they were very good for music because the sound quality was so much better than AM. And so the educational radio stations that came on the air in FM, because WHA was AM, so but this was FM, they played a lot of classical music. And I was working at the station. Everybody was listening to classical music. I was doing news. So that was a kind of a bummer, but it worked out. One thing, and the university put a lot of money into that radio station. And not as much as Wisconsin had, but it was very well funded. And they were a big, rather important national big force in educational radio. But one thing about WUOM that made it different from WHA or almost all the other radio stations, it did not have television. Boing. No television station. There it is. They had no television station. And here in Madison, WHA radio has WHA TV, you watch all the time. And most stations did. So WGBH radio had WGBH TV. They all did. Michigan didn't. And maybe it was smart, maybe it wasn't, but they never bothered to build a TV station. Okay. Next, let's comes next. Aha, 1967. Educational television has now come on the scene, largely funded by the Ford Foundation, which had inherited basically, when Henry Ford died, he left the Ford Motor Company to the Ford Foundation. They had a lot of money and they had to spend it on something. They spent a lot of it on public television. They did not spend it on public radio. They spent it on public television. But public television had hopes to go beyond what the Ford folks would do. And so they tried to they wanted basically a national American BBC, what they had in mind, a fourth network. There were 3 commercial networks. They wanted a fourth, and that would be their public network. And so they went to Congress and worked very, 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 very hard to get something called the Public Television Act passed in 1967. They were almost there when the manager of the radio station I had worked at UOM said, wait a minute. All you guys are happy to have public television funded because you all have public TV stations, but what about those of us who don't? Radio ought to be in this act. Well, no radio. Radio was not in the act. It specifically was left out, and so was instructional television, the stuff that the school stuff that was left out. It was all going to be public television for the general public. not for kids in school or anything else. Radio was left out. Well, that manager and other people of his ilk said, we're going to torpedo this whole thing if you don't put television in. Or if you don't, I'm sorry, if you don't put radio into the act. We're not going to, we'll go to our congressman, we'll say vote against it. And it was a nasty, nasty, nasty fight. All behind the scenes, of course, but I knew about it because I was friends with his manager, the guy who was doing it all. So the radio was left out. So they came up with a compromise, and I think that may be the next slide. Yeah, Ann Arbor, Michigan, we all know, keep going. Yeah, we had radio. And so they managed to get public television to agree that it would be and radio. Every time television appeared in the act, it would say and radio. Understanding, wink, wink, that radio would get about 10% of the money, television would get 90%. And it would be still called the Corporation for Public Television. And then when they came to a vote, congressman from Michigan said, yeah, shouldn't we call it the Corporation for Public Broadcasting? Uh-huh. And as time goes on, radio went to Congress again and said, no, we don't want 10%, we want 25%. Television was livid, not all this, they were really PO'd, but it happened. So radio got into the act with 25% of the money. 1969, 2 years later, public television is ready to go. They know exactly. They were pushing for this bill. They had a vision. They knew what they wanted. And Sesame Street. Wow, this was going to be, this was a big deal. And it put TV on the map almost immediately. But there were others, the Foresight, there were a bunch of programs that I remember, you don't. But Sesame Street, you do remember, because it continued on and on and on and on and on. So they were ready to go. But radio, these couple of people had gotten the act amended. They had no particular vision of what it was going to be. And the people who were running public broadcasting didn't care about radio. And so it just sort of sat there for a couple of years. But they had to spend some money on radio because the law said they had to. So what did they do? Send a kid to London. And I was a kid. And so I was sent to London for a year to work at the BBC to find out how it's done. How do you do this stuff here? And so I spent the year, and the idea was that I would come back and would do something. I wasn't going to be in charge of public radio. It was like 26 or 27. Anyway, whatever. So I came back, and the idea was I would be part of this new thing. I came back at the end of the year. They weren't ready. There was nothing there. The board of directors was still scratching his head. I don't know, what do we do? So we finally ended up, I think we should have another tag here. And by 1970, they decided they would call it National Public Radio. They still didn't quite know what it was supposed to be in terms of programming. They knew that it had to have a daily program, something every day that was pretty big to be noticed. But by and large, it was that was about it. So what else do we have? I don't know what's here. Okay, one of the things about public radio that would be different from public TV, that NPR would produce programming. PBS does not produce anything. It just acquires programming from one place or another, from public TV stations or BBC or other places. They just buy things and put it on the air. NPR would produce their own programming because, first of all, there were no stations that were really capable of producing national shows. And second, it really had to be more integrated. It couldn't just be a series of programs. A radio service has to have a personality and a character that's consistent. And so they decided they would produce programming, which was a huge improvement over what public television had. next. But what programming? Still not sure. There were too many radio stations to have to be the kind of fourth network that public television. Public television would be the fourth network: ABC, CBS, NBC, and PBS. There'd be four networks. Well, there are thousands of radio stations, and in any community, you had 30 stations in a place like Milwaukee. So it had to stand out and become distinctive. But we still didn't really know exactly what that was to be. And therefore, a guy who was born up here in the Sun Prairie, taught at West High School, and somehow got into the radio racket, and was manager of the station in Buffalo, New York, the itty bitty nothing educational radio station in Buffalo, New York. And he wrote the purposes of NPR. We need a vision. We need to know what we're going to do. What are we going to do? We're going to celebrate the human experience as infinitely varied. Well, that's nice, but what are we going to do at 5 o'clock tonight? You know, that's not very specific. So we went ahead and we decided we needed a name for the program. We said it had to be our Sesame Street, something big that everybody's going to notice. And we needed a title. I couldn't use Sesame Street, obviously, that'd been taken. So we went through the Seemering, the guy from Sun Prairie, put up in the staff area a sheet, and we could put in our names. Everybody would write suggestions and down what the name would be. Seemering started off by saying, "This is radio, damn it." Damn it, left out, but that was in the implication. This is radio. That didn't go over real well. So somebody else came up with present tense. Current, that's, yeah, it got exciting. No. So I said, I know what it is. Let's call it Give Us This Day. Give us this day. It's newsy, but it's not news, but it's current, contemporary, and it has kind of a spiritual element to it that kind of comes off of it. Nobody liked that either. I couldn't believe it. So somebody wrote underneath it, Our Daily Bread. That was the working title for a long time. Our Daily Bread, it's nourishing, it tastes good. Not bad. But at the last minute, the day that the press release had to go out naming this thing, this engineer we were all creative. He was this dull engineer, the type. He said, why don't we call it All Things Considered? Ah, good. Better than anything else we'd come up with. And there it was. So this program was to be All Things Considered. And it would be on at 5 o'clock every night Eastern time for 90 minutes. And it would be our big deal. So May 3rd, 1971, we took off and went with it. And Carl Schmidt, who was the director of radio here in Wisconsin, was on the board of directors, and he sent a memo. We didn't have emails in those days, but a written memo. And he said, our child is born, and it is ugly, which was true. And it went on for many months being ugly because it was kind of vague what we were supposed to be doing. Celebrate the human experience is infinitely varied. Okay. But it sort of depended on who came to work first, who got there first in the morning, or what it was going to be, because all the people there had different ideas of what it wanted this thing to be. So finally, the president said, you have to put someone in charge. Somebody has to be in charge of this thing. And there was a little survey of the staff, and it ended up being me. And so I was made the first producer of the program. And so I had been at the BBC, of course, so I had that model of, the BBC current affairs show. That's kind of what we did. And with news at the top, and then the featurey things would follow. It had a structure, which it had not had before, and that was an important difference. And I think there's more to that, but yeah. Oh, and then we would have personality hosts. We'd have people who would be recognizable and would be there every day, and people could identify with, because before we didn't. Who knows what's going to happen today? And so I ended up with Susan Stamberg, who is this big personality with a Bronx accent, kind of brassy, but distinct, like nothing else on public radio, certainly. And then Bob Edwards, who was the opposite, who was smooth, mellow, and put the two together, and it really worked very well. And anyway, the program became less ugly, and something of a success. I don't know what comes next. Let's find out. 1976. Jumping ahead a few ways. I came here. I left NPR in 76 and came here as to create something called Wisconsin Public Radio, which was, remember, we had the old educational radio network with the college, with the lectures and the school programming and all that. We cleared all that out and went to a much more live, newsy, current affairs kind of approach to it. And it was a struggle. There was a lot of politics. There's an organization. In order to build the statewide radio network, the legislature created a separate organization, separate from the university, to run all the FM stations. WHA did the programming, and they were fighting all the time. It was a classic war, particularly over television. They didn't really care about radio, but TV, they were fighting who's going to control state TV network. And but I managed to get the two working together for radio. It took them 10 more years to work together on television, but we got them worked on radio, and we came up with a plan for two statewide radio networks. One would be emphasize talk, and the other would have music on it, although it was, for reasons that get complicated, it would have some talk on it too. And it would be localized. We'd have local stations we'd have local programming in various parts of the state. That was a scheme, and it worked reasonably well. It took off. It went from, we had about 60,000 listeners of the old radio network, and it went up to 300,000. So it was a multiple. It was a certain, and it wasn't because Wisconsin Public Radio was such a genius thing. It's that the Wisconsin Educational Radio Network is pretty boring. And so that went on. Now see what's next. 1983. Jumping ahead here. NPR went bankrupt, or virtually went bankrupt. NPR was paid for totally by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which had been created by the Public Broadcasting Act. And so every year, they wrote a check for $10 million to NPR, and they spent it. Except that in 1983, they spent a lot more than $10 million, and they were virtually bankrupt. It turns out, I went back to NPR at that time as head of programming, basically to cut the budget. Not a lot of fun, but I was back there. And then out of it came a new financial plan. We would use what we call listener-dependent income. We would not be dependent on CPB. CPB would send all its radio money to the stations, not to NPR. Listener-dependent income means money from listeners, fund drives, more fund drives, and more fund drives, and underwriting, meaning people who wanted to reach those listeners, organizations, businesses, they would pay to reach those listeners. It's like commercial broadcasting in a sense, except that the base of the money is listeners. And that is really the ecosystem that we have now. It's mostly listener dependent money, listeners and underwriters. In Wisconsin, there's still a lot of state money and university money in it, but much more so than most places. Most of the places don't have much at all. And then this Corporation for Public Broadcasting sends checks to the individual stations who then buy the programming back from NPR. But NPR gets virtually nothing from CPB. So now that gives us sort of the system, basically the system we have now. I don't know what's next. What's next? Oh, 2024. Oh, that's too far. Didn't we skip something?
No, it goes from 83.
Okay, all right, all right. Well, I guess that's right. 2024, that's now. What's happening? Well, listenership is falling. It grew tremendously over those 50 years from 1971, when All Things Considered started, through the beginning of this century. But it's been falling. Listenership has been dropping off, and because listenership is falling off, income is falling off because it's all listener dependent. And if you don't have as many listeners, the underwriters aren't going to pay as much. And so the financial system that we set up in 1983 is falling apart. But why is that? More competition with the internet, podcasts. New York Times, NPR decided sometime in the 80s that it really just wanted to be the audio version of the New York Times. It would have pretty much everything the New York Times has, but on radio. Well, now the New York Times is producing a ton of audio, and they do the New York Times better than NPR does the New York Times. And so it's that's a tremendous problem. I got one of the other problems: audio on demand podcasts. And why should you have to be at the radio at 5 o'clock in the afternoon if you want to hear All Things Considered, if you can get a podcast and just listen to it whenever you want? Makes sense from a listener point of view. But it means fewer people listening to the radio at any one time. People are spending less time in cars because COVID, and then all these people using Zoom to work, to go to meetings. They're not driving places. They're just going on their computer. So, and radio's main listening place is the car. Well, that's slipping. So as a result, there's really for the first time since 1983, there's been a real crisis in public radio. I have nothing to do with it because I've been gone for a long time. So I don't have to worry about it, but I do. But in the past, I felt I had to help fix it, but now I can't. It's other people's problems. And I'm not sure how it's going to end up. They obviously need to do more with audio on demand, like podcasts and that sort of thing. But the stations that have tried it have put a ton of money into it and doesn't work because there's no income. And there's not enough, no single podcast have enough people listening to it to matter. You don't have millions of people listening to a podcast. You just have a few. And so just the economics don't seem to be working for an individual station. They will work for NPR because they have the whole country to sell to. So a highly specialized program that's of interest to golfers. Okay, there are a lot of golfers in the country, but how many are there in Madison or in Wisconsin? Yeah, it's a matter of scale. So it's a problem that I don't know the answer to, but a lot of people are worrying about it, and I'm not sure how it's going to play out. And one final slide. No, yeah, 2024, still in 2024. WPR, Wisconsin Public Radio, is going to, in about 2 weeks, make some significant changes in what they do. They're sort of saying it's because of the crisis in money and listenership and all that. But I think it's just that people, I guess I don't see where these changes are going to solve it. But they're changing things and they're going to do is basically what we wanted to do back in 1976. Have one stream of all news and talk and the other stream of all music, or mostly classical music. And that will be in place, I think it's May 20th, they're going to go to that, which means they're going to be dropping a lot of the local talk shows, which I'm sorry about that because I started a lot of it. And they're not doing much with the local stuff, which was another thing that I thought was important. But this will be a solid, dependable service, and I think it will probably do okay. But the fundamental problem of the economics and reaching people non-broadcast, not through the radio, but through all these other means, that hasn't been really resolved, and it's still up there. So I'm going to stop prattling on at this point. I'm open to questions, and maybe J.J. Larson has a question. No, he's on the screen. No, or I've forgotten your name. Yeah, or Dee and Val, whoever they are, wherever they are.
Dee and Val,
Yeah.
feel free to put a question in the chat.
Here we go. Okay. And if not, what's happening?
Interested in any ideas you have for Wisconsin Public Radio? What could they do? Have you given it a lot of thought? It's not your job anymore.
Yeah, I know.
But you've got me worried because I listen to Wisconsin Public Radio and I literally have paused my NPR podcast I had on before everybody arrived here.
Okay. Well, yeah.
So you scared me.
Well, yeah, that's gonna see, Wisconsin will survive because it has all this state and university support. You know, which most places, and they don't talk about that very much. You know, listeners provide 57% of the listener, it's most important source, and that's true. But the state and the university put in a lot. And so even if all the listener money went away, which it won't, it'll kind of go back to being the old Wisconsin Educational Radio Network, which survived, which it went on for 50 years without, and so it's not as if it'll go away, but they have more people than they really need. And that they probably lose some of those folks. But I don't know. I think there is some room for, I guess what the thing I have suggested and is that they have worked so hard to please listeners, do things that listeners will support. And that's been important. That's why they've been successful. But what they could do is reinforce the state and university, justify that by doing things that maybe listeners aren't that important, isn't that popular, but that politicians and university administrators will think are important. TV is very smart. The state cut the funding for instructional TV programs. And the staff at public television said, we're still going to do it. And they're using all kinds of money that they pull together to keep the service going, even though very few people actually watch it. But it's, education is important. And so they're saying, we're going to do education. And if they go to the legislature, they're gonna be able to say, you know, look what we're doing something good. And I think that's the kind of thing that public radio needs to do. Now, what that is another question. But that's, I think, part of one way to go with it. And we'll see. But it's gonna be very interesting to see what happens. And the new woman who's now has my old job, I think she's really sharp and really good, and I think she will do well. And it's hard because the politics of that place are really complicated. And I think she will handle that well, and I think she has a pretty good vision of what programming ought to be, and she's relatively young, and you know, so I kind of because of her, I'm quite optimistic. Her name is, oh, I'm not terrible at names. You got it. Sarah.
Donor, so I get
Yeah.
emails from her with all this.
Yeah, Sarah, it's a very classy kind of sounding name, like, you know, Fairbanks or something, you know. What's her name? It's classy, like a New England aristocrat. Sarah with an H. But she's really, I think she'll be okay.
Ashworth.
Ashworth.
Sarah Ashworth.
Ashworth, class, you know, Lady Sarah Ashworth, you can see that on some PBS show. So anyways, but so I'm optimistic because of her. I think she'll do fine.
Well, I feel better now, thank you.
Okay, no, it will be okay. It will be okay. But it's not boom time anymore. You know, because they were hiring people, a lot of people, because they had money. Okay, don't have money, no, they'll hire somebody to be the third assistant. You know, administrator. You know the type. He can run the computers. Yeah.
This is actually a serious question,
Yeah.
but it sounded like it was really dramatic in 1971 when it was all coming together. Has
Oh,
anybody
oh.
approached you about making a movie or writing a book? aside
Well, I
from
did write,
about this?
well, I wrote an earlier book about public radio nationally, called Listener Supported.
It seems like this would make a great movie, though.
Yeah, well, it's been talked about, but, there was a movie about Garrison Keillor. Remember it was really quite good. I think it was. Huh. Well, anyway, they did a movie about Garrison Keillor, and that was good. But this was. There have been a couple of things that have been discussed and they've never come to be. On the public radio's 50th anniversary, in 2021. There was a lot of talk about doing something, but it never happened.
How come there was so much fighting between TV and radio?
Oh, well, because that's the way people are. That's because there's no purpose. There's no clear purpose. Commercial broadcasting, they know their purpose, make money. Bottom line, does it make money? We'll do it. Does it not make money? We don't do it. If there's no bottom line, then somebody says, oh, we really ought to be doing opera all the time. Because I like opera. A lot of people like opera. And somebody else says, we ought to be doing news all the time. Or folk music, or kids programs. Or, you know, there's all these things that are all worthwhile, all good. But there's no bottom line that says we can do, it's nothing personal, but that's not going to make money. But if you say, I don't want to do kids programs. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, if you want to say we're not going to do kids programs, that is personal. You know, because there's, you know, I think it's important. Why don't you think it's important? So there's that, to fill us the fact that there's no bottom line. And there were a lot of creative people who had lots of ideas. And most of them were probably pretty good, but you can't do everything. you had to decide, okay, this is gonna be this, and we're not gonna do that. We're not gonna do full-length dramas on All Things Considered. Some people thought we should. We did a few. But it doesn't work. It's gotta be this, more or less the same every day. So people can tune in and know what to expect. So that's formatting and the weeding out of the stuff that you're not gonna do that was difficult.
And this surprised me about that, the TV and the radio, how they didn't want the radio in it, because like my kids grew up in homes that didn't have TV. And that, you know, the late sixties and early seventies, there was still a lot of families who didn't have TV. So that was really, I was surprised that there wasn't more push for the radio.
Yeah, yeah. Well, radio, it's been a big deal here in Wisconsin for a long time, because we were the only place that really had anything that was the few Midwestern universities like Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, were the only places that really did anything. You're late. It's over. It's over.
Haven't heard any questions. Well, I came because it's a history lesson, right?
Yeah.
So now it's history.
Yeah, no, that's right. It was great. There's making lots of videotape. Yeah. No, I've been very fortunate to have. It's a matter of, right place, right time. And lack of competition, because I happened to be at WUOM when this happened. And that's where the fight to get radio into the act, I wouldn't have paid any attention, so I was right involved with that, and then I was younger, they wanted to send somebody to BBC, you had to be under 30. Well, I was under 30, so off I went. And then a lot of people from Michigan came over to Wisconsin, and so I knew a couple of the folks, and they asked me to come with them. So I ended up here. Anyway, if I had been born a couple of years later, wouldn't have worked. Because there were lots of good people. In the beginning, there were people who had ideas for particular things they wanted to do, but there were not very many people who could see sort of how the overall thing could work. And now there are lots of people, there are a lot of people like that. They're a lot smarter than I am. But I was one of the few at the time, and I was under 30 and all. So it was I was very, very, very lucky because it was exciting and interesting. Most people never get that kind of experience.
Do you remember what some of the early All Things Considered shows were about?
Oh, yes. Well, the very first show was May 3rd, 1971. That was the day of the famous, well, not famous, it's famous to me, but the March on Washington. It was supposed to be May Day of 1971 against the war. Massive demonstrations. But May 1st was on a Saturday. Well, you can't disrupt Congress on Saturday, they're not there anyway. So they put it off to Monday, May 3rd, which happened to be the first day we went on the air. And so a lot of people remember that one because it was highly dramatic and highly biased, because all these young people who looked like the demonstrators themselves and sympathized with them were out there doing a highly sympathetic pieces about the demonstrations and how, the police said, one guy went to an officer and said, "Is it your policy to beat students over the head with clubs? Is that police policy here?" That was on the air. One of our reporters, it was a young woman being arrested. And she said, "Oh, help me, I'm being arrested." So he gave her his press credentials. And she was not arrested, then he was. But it was highly, well, I was one of the old ones there. I was about 30. Everybody else was younger. It was a bunch of kids. But so the war, that show that piece went on for 25 minutes. And it was highly, it was brilliantly produced, but it was not exactly fair. And we all, so that was one. The other one that I personally remember, nobody, and I told somebody about it, and they went back in the archives and found out it was true. The day of the Republican National Convention was opening. No, the Democratic National Convention in July of 1972. And I was producing All Things Considered at that time. And I noticed, I said, there's going to be an eclipse of the moon today. And I wonder if that means anything to an astrologer. So you've got this astrologer lady to come in, and AJ, All Things Considered, was much less serious then than it is now. Now it's really very serious, but we did a lot of light stuff. So we brought this astrologer in, and she said, "Oh, I don't think I can go on the air because astrologers have a code of ethics that we don't talk about bad things." Oh, bad things. And she said, "Well, they're not going to finish their business. They can't finish their business." Well, they seem to think went through it. They seem to have finished their business. And then a couple of weeks later, Tom Eagleton, who was the vice presidential nominee, it was found that he had been undergone psychiatric treatment. And McGovern dumped him. And they had to call the convention back to nominate another vice president. So she was right. It wasn't finished. They could not finish their work. So we have that. The person went back and they did find that tape. I was right. Nobody else seems to remember that. But I was right. And then, so the next Republican convention was coming up. And we said, "Well, let's do that one." It was in August. And she said, "Oh, no, this time I really can't go on. Because we don't predict terrible things." And I said, "Well, what could be so terrible?" He said, "Nixon's not going to finish his term." "Oh, he's going to die?" "No, he's not going to die." "Oh, that means Agnew's going to become president?" "No, he was a vice presidential nominee. He was vice president." "No, he's not going to become president because he resigned in a corruption thing." So, and she didn't say, "I did this, that's too bad. I just can't go on." So she never went on with that. We never did that on the air. It was just what she told us. But she was right. So those are a couple of things that stand out in my head 50 years later. But we did, it was fly by, we only had a few people. It was touch and go, a lot of creativity. One thing we did was we said, and I was sent up to the CBC, Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, to just go visit and see what they did for a week. And the one thing they did was commercials. They said, CBC has no commercials. We need commercials. So have the viewers or listeners write commercials for something you love. So I stole that idea. We came back and we said, All Things Considered needs commercials. So we had this contest, and I remember the first one was for fresh baked bread, homemade bread. And we did this commercial with a jingle and homemade bread. And we had then several people, a woman from Markesan, Wisconsin, had entered that contest. And there's several others. We have a lot of people, but we got these names of smart people around the country, and we used to just call them up. What's going on in your life in Markesan? And there was a guy out in Kansas. We used to call him a lot. But it was a different feel. It was more informal, more fun, frankly. And we won a lot of awards, and it was different. It's more serious now.
can I find somewhere to listen to those? Cause that is way different than the all things considered.
Yeah,
Is there a way to listen to old ones?
well, they're in the Library of Congress and they're probably online somewhere.
Gotta be, okay.
Yeah, yeah. The one thing, another one, we had commentators and I saw some publication, Goodman Ace. It was wrote columns, like a monthly column or something. Goodman Ace was in the golden age of radio. He and his wife were on it was called the Easy Aces. And they would just sit there and talk. Goodman Ace and his wife. And then her mother was always in the background commenting, but she was, but it was just, and it was I thought it was very funny, and he had a very interesting voice. And his wife Jane, Goodman Ace and his wife Jane, and then so I saw that he was still alive and writing, so we got in touch with him, and he did commentaries for us, and including the day that Jane died, and he wrote this beautiful piece in tribute to her. But he was a sweet old man who, and then he died. But we had him going for a while. That's the kind of thing we did. Plus the news, and we were big on Watergate because we all hated Nixon, and we had hired Nina Totenberg. She's still around. Yeah, Nina, baby. When the guy who suggested we hire her said, "Now I have to let you know that she is a female reporter of the pre-feminist days. She got her stories the old-fashioned way." And it was just true, it turns out. But she was very close to Judge Sirica, who was the judge in the Nixon trials. She was quite close to him. And then and then what was Supreme Court Justice. And there was she found out ahead of time what a story would be. What the decision was going to be, and we broadcast it ahead of, before the Supreme Court announced it. And question was, how did she know? And he said, I forgot the name of the guy. Anyway, so it's like Skippy and I are just friends. But she was Nina is a great reporter, and I didn't really care how she got her stories, but she got them. And so she was good. And the other one we had never became full-time was Judith Miller, who went to the New York Times and did the getting us into the Iraq War, when the Iraq War, and she had all these stories about the Iraqis killing or pulling babies out of incubators in Kuwait, and this really nasty stuff, which may or may not have been true, but she was inside. She had a real inside track with the Iraqi contingent in the United States. And of course, she later was the one who broke the story about who was it? Bork. Judge Bork, who was nominated for the Supreme Court, and she found out some scandals about him, and he eventually had to withdraw. But Nina's and she's still going. But she was real something.
Have you met Medna Chakrabarty?
No, I haven't. I like her a lot. Yeah, she's great. I would like to. She's the best. Makes everybody else seem. She got the voice and the intelligence and the quickness. No, she's. No, I wish I would.
I usually listen to her via podcasts. AJ, do you listen to her as well?
Yeah. Beside the point. On the point,
On
on point.
point.
Beside the point. That is most of public radio. This is on point. Yeah, she's fun.
Well, so you missed it. All Things Considered was once called Our Daily Bread.
That was the working title. Which I kind of still kind of like. All things considered, it's better, but. Well, should we quit?
Yeah. I think we could listen to you.
Oh,
listen to your
yeah.
Stories all day.
Yeah, some of it's true. But. Yeah, the stories get better the farther you're away from it. You know.
Dean Val just said in the chat, there's excellent information about the upcoming changes on WPR.org.
Oh, good. Yes, there are. Yeah, no, they have done a very good job of explaining it. Which I never did a very good job of that stuff. Just did it.